I'm Rachel, a 28-year-old woman who's always been the reliable one in the family. You know, the one everyone counts on when they need something, money, a shoulder to lean on, even small errands. I've been handling this role for as long as I can remember. If you need help, call Rachel. If you're short on cash, well, Rachel has a steady job. It's just how things go in my family, and honestly, it's exhausting. I don't mind helping its family, right? But I've started noticing this pattern where they don't reach out unless they need something from me. Calls and messages are rare otherwise. It's as if I'm just a backup resource, not really a daughter or sister in their eyes. For years, I convinced myself it was just the way family works, brushing it off like it didn't bother me. But eventually, I couldn't ignore the feeling of being a tool, rather than a loved one. Let me give you a bit of background. My parents and I don't have the warmest relationship. We talk, of course, but the real connection feels lacking. My two older brothers, Josh and Chris, are similar. They're both busy with their lives and families, yet somehow their busy lives always seem to involve me doing something for them. Like when my mom had medical bills piling up, guess who chipped in more than half of the payments? And when Chris's kids needed help with their school projects? Yep, Aunt Rachel was called in to save the day. Then, there are holiday gatherings. I've been the one covering extra costs, picking up the slack whenever the unexpected expenses pop up. It's like clockwork. It's not just about the money, though. It's the feeling that all my help, all my time, doesn't mean anything to them beyond the moment. When I reach out, they're busy or distracted, but when they need me, suddenly their schedules open up. Recently, things finally hit a boiling point. My older brother Josh, who by the way barely calls or texts unless he's got some new request, reached out. His message was casual, almost too friendly. He'd heard there were some openings at my workplace, and he thought he'd take a shot at one. Could I put in a good word for him with my boss? That's when it really struck me they only call when they want something. Not once in these years have I gotten a message like, "Hey Rachel, how are you holding up?" Or "Let's grab coffee sometime." It's always about what they need. That's when I decided I'd had enough. This was the moment to put my foot down. I was nervous, of course. I mean, it's my family. Part of me felt guilty, questioning if I was overreacting, but a bigger part of me was ready to finally say something. My best friend Lauren has been telling me for ages to stand up for myself. She sees it for what it is, and she's the one person who really listens when I vent. So after Josh's message, I texted her, telling her what happened and saying, "I think it's time I say something." She immediately replied, "Yes, it's about time you stopped letting them treat you like this." Still, I couldn't help second-guessing myself. What if I was just being selfish? What if this was normal family behavior, and I was reading too much into it? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed to address this, even if it caused a rift. It was time they knew how I felt. I started typing a message to our family group chat. At first, I struggled to find the right words. How do you tell your own family they've been treating you like an ATM or a backup plan, without sounding dramatic? After rewriting it a few times, I finally settled on something simple and honest. I didn't want to accuse anyone directly, I just wanted them to understand my perspective. The message I sent went something like, "Hey, I wanted to talk to you all about something that's been on my mind. I feel like I'm always the one everyone turns to when they need help, but it doesn't feel like it's mutual. I rarely hear from any of you unless there's a favor involved, and it started to make me feel used. I love being there for you, but I need to feel like it's a two-way street." As soon as I hit send, my heart was pounding. I half expected an immediate onslaught of messages, either defending or maybe even understanding what I'd said, but there was nothing for a good minute or so. Then my mom finally responded, but her reply was short and confused. "What do you mean by used, Rachel?" It was like she couldn't grasp the idea that her dependable daughter might have her own needs and boundaries. I took a deep breath and started typing again, trying to keep calm. I explained some of the specific instances, like the medical bills, the holiday costs, and the school projects. I emphasized that I don't mind helping, but I need to feel appreciated too. No response from Josh. Nothing from my dad, who usually tries to play the mediator. I could feel my frustration building. Was I just talking to a wall here? It was then that Lauren texted me, asking how it was going. I shared the conversation with her, and she reminded me that this was something I needed to do for my own peace of mind, regardless of how they responded. She told me to stay strong and not back down, no matter what guilt trips might come next. Sitting there, waiting for my family's response, I realized this was something I should have done years ago. I had spent so long ignoring my own feelings, putting everyone else first, and for what? To feel empty and used? This was my line in the sand. No matter how they responded, I knew I'd never go back to being their go-to person without boundaries. Update 1. So I hit send on the message, heart pounding, and waited. At first there was silence, like that kind of eerie quiet that settles before something big happens. Then, my mom's message popped up. She was confused, asking what I meant by feeling used. I almost rolled my eyes. I'd spelled it out, hadn't I? I figured she'd at least understand what I was saying, but apparently I'd need to go over it again. Meanwhile, Josh, no reply. The one person this whole thing was sparked by didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. It was like he was purposely ignoring the entire point. Maybe he thought if he stayed quiet, it would all just blow over. I didn't have high hopes, but it still annoyed me. Then my mom started defending him. She was saying he's just stressed and needs a break. This was nothing new. She'd always had a soft spot for Josh. He could do no wrong in her eyes, even if he barely lifted a finger to help anyone else. But this time I wasn't backing down. I listed out some examples for her. I reminded her of all the times I'd been the one to cover bills, help with her medical expenses, handle Chris's kids' school projects, and take care of holiday costs. Silence from my dad. Usually he tries to jump in and smooth things over whenever there's a family argument. Not a word from him this time. I don't know if he thought this was a lost cause or if he just didn't want to get involved. Either way, his silence bothered me. It felt like he was choosing to ignore the problem rather than help fix it. Then my mom came back with the guilt trip. She told me that I should be grateful to have family who depends on me, as if I'd somehow won the lottery. That was her angle, that needing me constantly was some kind of blessing I should be thankful for.
Right.
At that point, Chris decided to jump in. He told me I was overreacting, and that family helps each other without expecting anything back. It was as if they'd all agreed to completely ignore what I was actually saying. I replied, calmly as I could, that it wasn't about expecting something back. It was about feeling like it was always one-sided. I told them I loved being there for everyone, but I needed to feel appreciated, not just like the backup plan. Then, my mom hit me with the classic line. She accused me of keeping score. That one stung. I wasn't keeping score, I just wanted to be valued as part of the family, not just the safety net. But of course, trying to explain that to them felt like talking to a wall. They seemed set on making this about me being selfish. I messaged Lauren, my best friend, to let her know how things were going down. She backed me up immediately, saying I was totally right to call them out. Her messages were full of good for you, and don't let them twist this. Knowing she had my back made it easier to keep going, but the anger was building. Every message from them just made me more certain that they'd never even thought about my feelings. Finally, after what felt like forever, Josh responded with a single word, fine, just fine, no apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. It was the ultimate passive-aggressive response, and it showed me exactly how much he cared about my concerns. He didn't even try to address the issue. It was like he couldn't be bothered. After that, I felt deflated. I'd put myself out there, hoping they'd at least try to understand where I was coming from, but instead, they just doubled down on the idea that I was the problem. Still, I was proud I'd finally spoken up. I'd spent years staying quiet, trying not to rock the boat, but now, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. If they weren't willing to see my side, I'd have to start setting boundaries for myself. So, I left the conversation there, no more back and forth. I'd said my piece, and I knew they'd never fully get it. But at least for once, I'd actually told them how I felt, instead of just nodding along. As I sat there, I started thinking about all the years I'd spent holding back, hoping they'd appreciate me if I just kept helping. I knew now that wasn't going to happen. Update 2. The day after I sent that message in the family group chat, my phone started buzzing nonstop. I figured they'd come back with their arguments and justifications, but I wasn't expecting the full-on guilt campaign that followed. First, it was my mom. She called me right away, skipping any small talk. Why would you hurt your family like this? She started, almost sounding wounded. It was clear she'd already made up her mind that I was in the wrong. She acted as if my message had been some huge betrayal, like I'd gone out of my way to damage everyone. I stayed calm, repeating what I'd already said. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, I just wanted a little reciprocity. All I was asking for was to be appreciated for once, instead of just being the fallback for everyone's problems. But she wasn't having it. Every time I tried to explain, she brought up something else, twisting my words. When I didn't back down, my dad finally decided to chime in. His voice was serious, like he was scolding me. He said families don't keep track of who's done what, that we should be there for each other no matter what. I told him it wasn't about keeping track, it was about how they never reached out unless they needed something from me. That seemed to fly right over his head, and instead of listening, he just kept repeating that family helps family without expecting anything in return. Then my mom went in for the emotional appeal. She started saying things like, you're putting a price on love, Rachel, making it sound like I was treating family like a business transaction. The way she said it made me sound so cold, and it almost worked, almost. But then I thought about how many times I'd been there going out of my way and how rare it was for them to even check in on me without needing something. After I got off the phone with them, I called Lauren. She listened as I went through the whole call, her voice steady and supportive. She reminded me that I'd spent years putting them first, and that standing up for myself didn't make me a bad person. Don't let them twist this, Rachel, she said. You have a right to be heard. She kept telling me to hold firm and not let them make me feel guilty for finally setting boundaries. That call was exactly what I needed. But the guilt tripping didn't stop there. The next day, my brother Josh sent me a private text. All he wrote was that I was being selfish and that he'd thought I was better than this. There was no, let's talk, no, I understand. Just a straight-up accusation. It was like he had zero interest in understanding my side. In his mind, I was just being difficult. It hit me then how little support Josh had ever actually given me. He hadn't ever been there for me, not emotionally, not financially, not in any way that counted. He'd pop up when he needed something, like that job referral, but vanish as soon as he got what he wanted. It was a pattern, one I'd been too willing to ignore. Realizing this made me feel even more certain I was doing the right thing. If he couldn't handle a simple conversation about my boundaries, that was his problem, not mine. The longer they dismissed my feelings, the stronger my determination grew. I thought back to other times they'd left me hanging when I'd needed them. There was one situation that came to mind, a few years ago when I'd hit a tough spot financially. I'd hinted that I could use some help, but everyone had been too busy or tight on money. Yet when they needed something from me, my own finances and time were somehow supposed to be flexible. Remembering that moment made me more sure I wasn't in the wrong for finally setting boundaries. So, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them drag me into their guilt games. I decided that from now on, I wouldn't drop everything just because they called with last-minute emergencies. If they wanted my help, they'd have to respect my time and boundaries. I wasn't their personal safety net anymore. After that, the calls and texts slowed down. My family's new tactic? The silent treatment? They ignored me for days, maybe hoping I'd feel so guilty I'd apologize and go back to the old arrangement. But I didn't cave. If anything, their silence gave me space to really think about everything. When I talked to Lauren about it, she encouraged me to stay strong. She reminded me that their silence was just another way to try and control the situation. They're testing you to see if you'll break, she said. And she was right. I could see what they were doing. They were hoping I'd feel so isolated I'd give in. But for the first time, I didn't want to go back. I knew I'd done the right thing, even if they couldn't see it. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing my happiness just to keep everyone else comfortable. This time, I was choosing myself. Update 3. A week passed with radio silence from my family. Just as I was getting used to the quiet, my mom reached out, suggesting a family heart-to-heart to clear the air. She made it sound like we'd all just sit down and have a calm discussion, as if we could sweep everything under the rug with a few apologies and move on. I was skeptical. It didn't feel like they'd suddenly developed an interest in understanding my side. But still, part of me thought that maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to finally be heard. I reluctantly agreed to meet. We picked a weekend, and the plan was for me to come over to my parents' place. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense, and everyone was putting on this fake politeness. My dad was making small talk about work, my mom was pretending to be cheerful, and Josh was just staring at his phone, barely looking up. Chris seemed the most normal, but even he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. After a few minutes of forced conversation, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked if we could get to the point of the meeting. My mom gave a sigh and said, "We're all here to understand each other better." But it felt like she was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear. I looked around, waiting for someone to acknowledge what I'd actually said in my message. Nothing. Just blank stares. So I asked them directly if they understood why I felt the way I did. My mom immediately started deflecting. She waved her hand, saying, "Oh, everyone has issues in families, Rachel. It's normal." That response was exactly what I'd expected, but still frustrating to hear. It was like she thought my concerns were just minor issues that could be dismissed. My dad mumbled an apology, but it was so half-hearted I could barely take it seriously. He said, "Well, we're sorry if you felt that way." If. That one word said it all. It was the kind of apology you give when you don't actually believe you're in the wrong. Then Josh jumped in. He brought up this one time, years ago when he'd helped me move apartments. I'd been in a pinch, and he'd spent a few hours helping me haul boxes. Now, he was using it as a way to say I owed him, implying that he'd done his part and that I was being unfair. He conveniently left out the fact that I'd helped him out a dozen times over since then. Just when I thought I was outnumbered, Chris, my other brother, quietly admitted, "Maybe we do rely on you a bit too much." I was genuinely shocked. It was the first time any of them had acknowledged the imbalance. But before I could respond, my mom cut in, saying, "Rachel, you're misunderstanding what family is about. We all have our roles." That comment was enough to make my blood boil. My role was apparently to be the one everyone leaned on, no questions asked. But when I needed support, they were too busy or expected me to handle things myself. I told them, point blank, that I didn't mind helping, but I needed the relationship to be mutual. They couldn't just come to me when they needed something and ignore me the rest of the time. That's when my mom tried to brush the whole thing off. She looked at me and said, "Let's just move on from this, Rachel. Let's be a family again. No hard feelings." It was like she was sweeping all my concerns under the rug, hoping I'd just go along with it. But I didn't. I refused to let them gloss over everything. I explained that I was still willing to be there when they genuinely needed help, but I wouldn't keep dropping everything at a moment's notice, or feel like I was the only one responsible for everyone's problems. My days of being the safety net were over. The room went quiet. I could see they were surprised I wasn't backing down. I didn't raise my voice, but I was firm. I needed them to understand that things had to change if they wanted me to stay involved in their lives. For the first time, it felt like I was setting the terms. Finally, my dad spoke up again. He looked at me, and his voice softened. He didn't apologize, but he said, "All right, Rachel, if that's how you feel." It wasn't a commitment to change, but it was as close as I was going to get. I left that day without apologizing. I knew they weren't going to suddenly change overnight, but I felt a sense of closure. I'd said everything I needed to say, and I didn't back down. They might never fully get it, but I was done bending over backward to keep the peace. This time, I was choosing myself, and it felt like the start of something new. Update 4. Days passed without a single message or call from my family. After the heart-to-heart, it seemed like they'd all decided to go silent, as if hoping I'd come crawling back and apologize. At first, it felt strange. I'd grown so used to their constant requests and check-ins when they needed something, that this silence was almost unsettling. But deep down, I knew what was happening. They were using the silent treatment, expecting me to feel guilty enough to break. At times, I caught myself checking my phone, half expecting a message or missed call. But nothing. It was like they were all on some silent boycott, and I was the only one who hadn't received the memo. It wasn't long before I started feeling the isolation. Like I was somehow cut off from the family without even being told. It was uncomfortable, and a part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. I told Lauren what was happening, and she didn't hold back. She called it out for what it was, manipulation. She explained that they were likely hoping I'd feel lonely and give in to whatever they wanted, returning to my old role. "This silence isn't just a coincidence," she said. "They want you to feel isolated. Don't fall for it." Hearing her say it so clearly helped me see it from the outside, like a strategy they were using to get me back in line. Then, after days of silence, Josh's message finally came through. He didn't waste any words, going straight for a jab. His message called me dramatic, saying he couldn't believe I was acting like this over a few favors. He made it sound like I was blowing things out of proportion, turning minor issues into some big problem. No acknowledgement, no attempt to understand where I was coming from, just a quick message to label me as difficult and over the top. Before I could even process Josh's text, my mom's message came through. Hers was short but cryptic, like she was talking down to me. "We're here when you're ready to be family again," she wrote, as if I'd somehow declared myself no longer part of the family. She didn't even try to understand. It was all about me coming back to normal, like setting boundaries had turned me into someone they didn't recognize. Seeing those messages made it clear what they were trying to do. They wanted me to question my decision, to feel like I was the one in the wrong. It was classic gaslighting, trying to make me doubt my reality. They were acting as though I was being irrational, like I was going through a phase and would eventually snap out of it. At times, I did start second-guessing myself. Was I being unreasonable? Was it really that bad, or was I just making it a bigger deal than it was? But every time I started to doubt, I reminded myself of how one-sided things had been, of how many times I'd put my own needs aside for theirs. I wanted a healthy, balanced relationship with them, not one where I was only valued for what I could do for them. I threw myself into my friendships and my own routine. Lauren and a few other close friends became my go-to support system. They kept me grounded, reminding me why I was doing this. It wasn't just about one disagreement, it was about a lifetime of always giving and never being appreciated. The more time I spent with people who genuinely cared about my well-being, the clearer it became that my family's version of love came with conditions. As the days went on, I noticed small changes. Without the constant pressure to be available for every little thing, I felt lighter, less stressed. My mental health was improving, little by little. It was like I'd finally given myself permission to breathe. I realized that I'd been carrying around this weight for years, always trying to keep everyone else happy at my own expense. Letting go of that responsibility was freeing, even if it was hard. But the silence continued. Even my dad, who would usually check in if things got tense, was nowhere to be found. It was like they'd all agreed to completely ignore me until I caved. I won't lie, there were moments when it hurt, realizing that the people I'd been there for over and over could so easily cut me off when I needed them to listen. Yet, even with the hurt, I knew I couldn't go back. Apologizing now would only reset everything to how it used to be, and I couldn't handle that. I'd spent too many years compromising my own happiness just to keep the peace. This time, I wasn't going to bend. It took time, but eventually I reached a point where I accepted the silence for what it was. I wasn't going to let their tactics pull me back in. If this was what it took to finally stand up for myself, then I'd endure it. This was about setting boundaries, something I should have done years ago. And whether they came around or not, I was done sacrificing my own well-being to keep them comfortable. Update 5. Months passed, and the silence from my family continued. At first, it felt strange, like there was this empty space where their calls and texts used to be. But gradually, I adjusted. I stopped expecting to see a message from them and found a sense of peace in the quiet. For the first time, I was living life on my own terms without waiting for a last-minute favor request or financial emergency. With this newfound space, I decided to focus on myself. I picked up a few hobbies I'd neglected over the years, things I'd been too busy to enjoy because I'd always been too wrapped up in everyone else's needs. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. It was relaxing, almost therapeutic, to put my thoughts into colors and shapes without worrying about anyone else's approval. Without constantly being the family problem solver, I noticed another unexpected benefit. My finances were improving. I wasn't paying for unexpected bills or loaning out money to cover someone else's costs. Suddenly, my budget was in my own hands. I could save, invest, and even treat myself to things I used to pass up. Slowly but surely, I was building a sense of security and stability I hadn't felt in years. My mental health improved too. I wasn't carrying around the stress of waiting for the next call or worrying about how I'd make everyone else happy. There was a freedom in knowing that my time and energy were my own. I began sleeping better, focusing more at work, and even found myself smiling more often. People noticed the difference. I felt like a new person. With my career, things started looking up as well. I threw myself into my work, taking on projects that excited me, instead of just coasting along. I was recognized for my efforts and eventually got a promotion I'd been eyeing for a while. For once, I wasn't looking for validation from my family, I was finding it in myself and my accomplishments. It felt good to be moving forward without the weight of anyone else's expectations holding me back. As time went on, I built a stronger social circle. I met new friends through work, joined a local painting class, and reconnected with a few old friends I'd lost touch with. These people weren't leaning on me or expecting things from me. They genuinely wanted to spend time together. I felt more supported than I ever had with my family. It was refreshing to be around people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. One day, as I looked around at all the positive changes in my life, I felt a shift in perspective. I realized that I still cared about my family, but I didn't need to be the one fixing everything to prove it. I could love them from a distance without feeling obligated to meet every one of their needs. It was possible to care about them while setting boundaries that protected my peace. Out of the blue, my mom finally reached out. She sent a text, asking how I was and saying it'd been too long since we last talked. She didn't mention the silent treatment or acknowledge what had happened. It felt like an attempt to smooth things over without actually addressing any of the issues. I thought about responding right away, but then I realized I didn't owe her an immediate reply. When I did respond, I kept it polite but brief. I thanked her for checking in and let her know I was doing well. I didn't offer to meet up or dive into any deep conversations. For the first time, I was engaging on my terms. It felt empowering to respond without opening the door too wide. I didn't feel the need to fix things or go back to the way things were. I was content with keeping a little distance. From then on, whenever my family reached out, I responded politely but didn't jump back into the old dynamic. I didn't drop everything to help with their latest problem. If they asked for something unreasonable, I simply declined. My peace was too valuable to risk going back to the old cycle. Reflecting on everything, I realized how much I'd grown through this experience. I'd always thought that loving my family meant sacrificing my own needs, but now I saw it differently. Love didn't have to come with a cost to my own happiness. I forgave them, not because they'd changed or apologized, but because holding on to resentment wasn't worth it. I could move forward without expecting them to be different. This journey had shown me what I was capable of when I prioritized myself. I'd found strength in setting boundaries, and I knew I wouldn't lose that again. I was done compromising my well-being for their approval. In the end, I felt free. Free to live life as I chose, free to focus on my happiness, and free from the endless cycle of being everyone's fallback. I'd learned that I didn't need anyone else's permission to put myself first. And for the first time, I was excited about what lay ahead, knowing that whatever came next, I'd be ready for it.